Like everything melted down yesterday.
Well, that's right. I mean, the bottom kind of dropped out of the barrel when Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell went beyond that standard line we've heard so much, that if this is true, Roy Moore should step aside. Instead, Mitch McConnell and several Republican senators said they'd heard all they needed to hear, that they believed these women and that Roy Moore should get out of the race. But Roy Moore responded to this latest allegation the same way he responded to the first ones. I never did anything appropriate. This is a hit job by liberal institutions to take me down, and I'm not going anywhere.
You know, with all this being said, and I know that the yearbook, she brought up the yearbook, and everyone's asking, when was the last time a 32-year-old man signed a yearbook, which is a bit of a creeper. And then you have the New Yorker story where he was banned from the mall. So it seems like more and more of these women's stories are being somehow affirmed where his story isn't really holding any water.
Well, and that's what so many of these senators are saying, that they're hearing these claims, and of course Roy Moore is entitled to deny these things. This is not a legal issue, but they're all saying his denials are not as well assembled as these claims, that the claims seem to make more sense, especially when you start hearing the circumstantial evidence from people that worked with Moore at the time, people that commonly describe him scoping out teenage girls, people telling not just the New Yorker, but Alabama's own AL.com, that it was a common sight at the Gadsden Mall to see Roy Moore alone walking around the mall on a Friday night as if he was a teenager talking to teenage girls. At one point, yeah, you had a security worker there apparently telling people, keep an eye on this guy for me.
Anybody bring up the fact that these Republicans in Washington being critical of this might backfire and the Alabama voters say, hey, don't tell us who we can and can't vote for. We're really going to vote for this guy now.
I don't think Roy Moore is particularly bothered by what Mitch McConnell says about him, right? I mean, this is a guy who is running explicitly against Mitch McConnell, calling him out at every rally that he'd have. The big question for Roy Moore is going to be, if there is enough backlash against him, if there's enough Senate Republicans that say you're simply not welcome here, it's not an issue of getting elected. It's an issue of actually getting your seat in the Senate. With a two-thirds vote, that would mean all 48 Democrats plus more than a dozen Republicans, it's conceivable that the Senate could vote not to seat him. Now, that would be unusual. Generally, we heard about most of these sorts of things happening around the Civil War era with Confederate senators, but it's a possibility, and you're hearing rumblings like that. Cory Gardner, the head of a powerful Senate Republican committee, has said not only are we not going to fund this guy's campaign, but I would consider voting to unseat him.
But it would be an all-out war in the Republican Party if the Alabama voters don't get the senator they choose to represent them in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And Roy Moore has made it about this sort of a battle right now. You don't hear him talking so much about Beverly Nelson or about Lee Korfman, right? You hear him talking about the Washington Post, Senate Republican leadership, and Gloria Allred. And that is where he's trying to keep the conversation, because if that's the conversation, then Alabama voters generally you'd think would be on his side. If it's about the nitty-gritty of whether he was into dating teenage girls at the time, that's music to the ears of somebody like Doug Jones. But also, you know, you mentioned the backfiring. This is exactly the reason that national Democrats have not gotten involved in this race. Remember John Ossoff in Alabama? All of a sudden he had money coming in from Nancy Pelosi in Silicon Valley. Democrats really want to avoid that optic this time.
So the Democrats are just not even, they're just avoiding this and just watching this play out.
Yeah, I mean, you've got groups like Move On, you know, sort of trying to raise a little bit of money, but even as people around Doug Jones say, hey, we could really use the DNC coming in here and giving us some funds, trying to do some organization, national Democrats really want to avoid that image. And so Doug Jones has actually been quite quiet on this topic as well. He's not, you know, looking to make it look as if he's out to attack Roy Moore. He's just letting these allegations speak for themselves.
Brad Mielke, have a good day. Thanks.